Thanks everybody for joining for the next round of our EPAC meetings. Um, this is the June 17th meeting, and we really appreciate everybody being able to join. I know we didn't have a lot of time to coordinate exactly which Monday afternoon was going to be the best Monday for everybody, but we figured we'd try to get it on the calendar as soon as possible because we do have quite a bit of information to talk through this week. We wanted to start with a presentation of the final capacity expansion results for scenario 1 of the CGPP. I know this is something we've given a preliminary look at about a couple months ago, but in the meantime, we have had a couple of updates to those results, as will happen regularly when you have like a new advanced modeling framework you're using and testing all the data for the first time. So we have some new results there that we're going to talk through. And then as we have time, we'll switch into a presentation from the joint utilities on their siting methodology. And you'll remember that's the methodology for translating the zonal results from the capacity expansion model into a more granular nodal model to determine how those resources are being cited, which is really important because then that determines what grid upgrades might be required to enable that growth of load and integration of renewables in the future. So we hope to hit those top two items today, and if we have more time at the end, we might be able to have time to switch to discussing some sensitivities that we might be able to run on these three capacity expansion scenarios. But I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath for that. We have a lot to talk through in those first two pieces. We're going to start with the capacity expansion results, the final results there. But before I turn it over to the NYISO, I did want to let everybody know that there has been, I think, one change to the assumptions in that scenario 1 capacity expansion results. And it's not necessarily a huge change, it's just kind of a tweak we had to make based on the initial capacity expansion results we were getting since the last time we were able to present here. We had noticed once we started looking at some of the zonal results that the capacity expansion model was doing what it does and was being very literal with the information we were providing through the supply curve assessment. And if you've seen that supply curve assessment, when you sort it by county or by cost, you'll notice that a lot of the solar resources are concentrated not just in one zone, but in just a handful of counties within that zone. And so when you give a model who's literally just trying to cost minimize to the decimal point, the capacity expansion model was really choosing all the resources in a certain county or certain zone beyond what was feasible within one run. And we looked into the issue in those results and saw that based on the existing headroom that we have on the system, it's very, very shortly in the future, in the early 2030s, where we actually get to the point where every zone in New York State has already reached its headroom limit. And so that cost of increasing headroom didn't matter as much as we thought it was going to. The initial reason for putting a cost to add headroom into each zone was that we thought it was going to be able to make the model choose using headroom in one zone versus building headroom in another zone to get cheap access to cheaper resources, so we could see that trade-off. But what ended up happening was the model needed to build so many more renewables because of the load growth that all the zones got to the point where they needed to add headroom. So it basically got back to the point where it was essentially the same as not having a headroom cost in there at all. And so we had to make some decisions on a fairly quick time frame to try to get to final results. And we had the the JU talk to experts and talk amongst themselves about how to better implement a headroom cost that might actually differentiate between the cost of resources. And we were able to implement a staggered or a staged headroom cost that increases over time by gigawatts of resources. So I think the exact number, which you'll see in the presentation here shortly, the exact number we fell back on was a 15% increase in that headroom cost that we've already implemented the model, but a 15% increase in that for every additional gigawatt of capacity you put into that same zone. And so that's trying to capture that differentiation between adding 1 gigawatt of headroom versus another 5 or 6 within the same zone. It's going to get more and more expensive the more you add there. And that allowed us to finally find a way to get the model to differentiate between zones again in a way it wasn't when there was just one flat headroom increasing cost across the zones. So that was kind of the one big change that's happened since April. We didn't really have time to kind of stop and bring that to everybody and kind of discuss it. So we had to make some executive decisions, unfortunately, which we hope we won't have to do in the future, but that's something we had to do here. And we'll talk through the results now. And the results you'll be seeing today are the final results, which include that new assumption. So if there's any questions now, I can take those now, but then there's also going to be a full presentation of the results by the NISO here shortly.
Skylar, Bill Acker, just a question on that. So I think it's an interesting solution to try to have this kind of staggered incremental headroom cost. I'm wondering about the low growth and the alignment between low growth and where the renewables go. I'm thinking particularly about, in certain cases, the low growth is going to substantially increase hosting capacity. Was that alignment considered in this? So if you have a region where you do have a either staggered effect happening with 15% extra per gigawatt, but you have much more low growth in that region, I would think that would mitigate it pretty substantially.
That's a great question, Bill. I don't know about the headroom the utilities have calculated, whether that incorporates the changing of headroom potentially over time due to load growth. Does somebody from the utilities have a better answer for that?
Yeah, hello, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid. So we did look at, I think it was a 2030, a 2035, and a 2040 case. So we calculated headroom for each of those years.
Okay, so at least some, if not all of that effect of, obviously we had the load forecast for those years, so the load is higher in those years that you're doing those headroom analyses, so that should incorporate what Bill's talking about to the most part?
I think so.
Good, thanks, Jeff.
And the other thing I would mention is that for some resources, I think you're spot on, Bill, that it will kind of have a one-to-one approach, but at some point, we just exceed the maximum capability of a lot of those local systems. So that's going to be one issue. And the second issue is just the location and method for interconnecting a lot of the large scale renewable resources ends up being, not necessarily directly connecting into load substations. It's, maybe at a different segment that has to go up to the high voltage system and then back down to find load again. And so there's potential for, in the long term, a lot of those resources needing additional upgrades to get connected to the high voltage long distance system anyway, even with load growth. I'm not sure how granular we're going to be able to get right now in the capacity expansion results about that, but that's a impact we probably will see better in the later stages when we start looking at more granular, territory specific results. Any other questions before we jump in? Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the NISO folks now to walk through the presentation of capacity expansion results for scenario 1.
All right, thanks, Skylar. This is Keith Burrell from the NISO. Our primary presenter on the state scenario results is Kevin Revis. Skylar, do you want us individually to present our screen? Oh, I see Kevin's presenting his screen. Okay.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Kevin.
I think we're good to go.
Sounds good. Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Skylar. Just doing a sound check here. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Excellent. All right. So yes, today we're going to dive into some of the state scenario results here. And Skylar, I appreciate the overview that you gave on headroom. I'll reiterate that a bit here, just for everyone to see how that works and maybe in a little bit more detail. But I'll go ahead and dive right in. So today's agenda is to go through, just a brief overview, just to remind folks of the CGPP scenarios and how they interact with the NISO outlook. And then I'll discuss what has changed since we talked at the last EPAC. And then finally, I'll get into the official results here, both at the NICA level and the zonal level. So I know folks have been waiting patiently for the zonal information, so we'll have that to present today. And before I get into the results, just wanted to remind folks of the assumptions that are going into the state scenario. So this slide gives that at a high level. And starting with the peak in energy, so the load forecast that we use, that's coming from the Climate Action Council integration analysis. And then in addition to that, those loads provided in that analysis, we have the addition of large loads, which are coming from the 2023 NISO Gold Book, and the addition of electrolysis loads, which are also informed by the integration analysis. And specifically, we have the assumption in there that is the electrolysis is half of the economy-wide hydrogen demand that's being met in state, and that increases the load. We also have the headroom assumptions, as we've been discussing here, which is meant to represent local transmission and the distribution system, and plus the additional upgrade costs. We have the formula for achievement of 70 by 30, which includes electrolysis and net storage charge. We have a net zero annual NICA imports assumption that starts in 2040. We have age-based fossil retirements, and that's for existing units. And then for the hydrogen-powered combustion turbines that are our candidate DFERs in the capacity expansion model, these units will add a corresponding electrolysis load as they use generation in zones A through E. So there's a tie between the use of hydrogen and an increase in electrolysis load. But just to note that these units have a very high operating cost to run, and we can see the impact of that within the results. And then finally, the capital costs for the resources that we have by technology come from the NYSERDA supply curve analysis. So hopefully that's just a review for most people, but wanted to make sure the assumptions were clear and that this is just clear for everyone. So again, as a reminder here, the state scenario is kind of the crossover point between both the NISO system and resource outlook and the CGPP. And we'll be getting into additional scenarios at a later time. And that'll all go into this CGPP analysis. So as Skylar mentioned, and I'll just review that quickly, what has changed since the last EPAC is that assumption for headroom and the use of a 15% compounding cost for every additional 1 gigawatt of headroom that's added within each zone. And so the updated results include this assumption, and it leads to an increased distribution of generation capacity rather than a concentration in like a single zone, and that would be driven by the costs assumed in the supply curve analysis. So it's an assumption that was agreed upon here and impacts the results in a way that makes a little bit more sense. But overall, the NICA level trends that we presented back in April are consistent to what's going to be presented here today. So that's mostly a zonal level impact. And then finally, just to show this visually, this is what the 15% headroom cost curve looks like. So again, this is implemented on a zonal basis. And as the headroom is added within a zone, there is an increase in cost. So with that, I can start to get into the official results here. So as we've seen in previous presentations, we have the generation the annual generation and the installed capacity over time here. And as I mentioned, this is fairly similar to what has been presented before. So we have a high level of solar capacity, as well as additions of land-based wind and offshore wind. And we specifically have hydrogen capacity that's being added to replace fossil fuel capacity. And that this new hydrogen capacity, because it has such a high cost, it doesn't contribute to the generation a whole lot. The model prefers lower cost resources like the wind, both offshore and onshore, and the solar capacity. So with that, I'll keep going and start getting into the zonal breakdown here.
Hey, Kevin?
Yep.
Do you want to take questions as we're going here? I have
Yeah,
my
that's
hand up
fine.
if I didn't see it. This is Bill Acker, New York Best again. I'm just wondering, this concept of the compounding 15% on headroom makes some sense to me, but I'm wondering, how did you decide on 15%? I mean, why not 10%? Why not 20%? Can you give us a little bit of how you came up with that number?
Yeah, yes, thanks for the question, Bill. That was a rough estimate provided by the DPS and agreed upon with the joint utilities. And so I don't have more information beyond that, but I'm happy to, if Skylar or anyone else wants to touch on that. But that's all the information that I have on that.
Yeah, Bill, that was a number developed by the utilities, looking into, what is the typical increment that they would expect if they were trying to basically increase the amount of capability within their territory for each additional gigawatt. What do they think the, expanding from 1 to 2 or versus 1 to 3, is that linear? Is that exponential? And it ended up being, exponential. And I think based on their estimates, it came out to 15%. I'm not sure if anybody from the JU wants to cite any additional numbers or go into that process a bit more, but it was basically came from the utility estimates of increasing their systems.
Okay, thanks, Skylar.
Great, thanks, Skylar.
I think we have one more hand, Anna.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Anna Summer from Energy Futures Group on behalf of WEACT. You noted, Kevin, that the model was showing relatively low utilization of the hydrogen resources, and that was helpful to hear because that was certainly something that we noticed the last time results were presented. And I wondered if you had undertaken any activities to try and suss out why that is. I know that you're not doing any hourly chronological runs, but were you able to compare the output capacity factors to the input renewable profiles, or did you use any of the block settings to try and put hours together so that there would be a little bit more chronology in the time sampling or anything like that?
Yeah, thanks, Anna, for the question. So the reason why the hydrogen units just aren't preferred for like energy and generation is they're just very much more expensive than all of the other options. So the model, being an economic model, really doesn't want to choose these unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think that's what, with this small amount of generation that these units are doing in these later years, is specifically like on peak on generation. So it's really only at that time period that it wants to use these resources. And there's also, with these hydrogen units, it's also a unit that will add load to the system if they are generating because of how we've set up the electrolysis constraints here. So there's kind of a double whammy on the hydrogen here. It's first off, it's expensive, and secondly, it will add load. And just to comment on the time representation that we used here. So we use a representative days methodology, which basically tries to get at a certain, it comes down to like 13 representative days that we use to chronologically represent the days throughout our model years.
Oh,
And s-
okay. Gotcha. Okay. So you're not using partial chronology then?
Nope.
Okay, gotcha. That definitely makes sense from the perspective of the hydrogen resources being more expensive. I guess what I'm getting at, and I'm a little bit less concerned about that, knowing that you're using the sampled methodology, is that oftentimes when we see low utilization of really expensive resources in a capacity expansion model combined with a high level of renewables, it's really just that those events that result in the dispatch of the expensive resources are being smoothed out or sampled out in some way through the time sampling settings. And so that when you do the production cost run, you actually see that those resources get used a lot more.
Mhm.
And so that's what I'm wondering about is if there's some way that you can tell whether you would actually get energy adequacy out of the plan, given that you're just doing a capacity expansion run. And sometimes those things can be really obvious. Like, for example, your model might show that you have a 26% capacity factor for solar projects on average, when that doesn't match the capacity factor of the production profile on an hourly basis that you put into the model. So it's those sorts of things that I was wondering about, Kevin.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's great questions. On the, we preserve the chronology of the hours within the specific days that we represent, but it is represented in certain blocks. So, for example, in a 24-hour period, we don't represent it exactly at the hourly basis. It does it in, I believe, like 4 or 6 hour chunks. So there is a little bit of shaving at peak, I would say. And if that sounds incorrect to any of my fellow NISO folks, feel free to chime in. But so the representation at peak is not exactly perfect, but it's kind of a modeling trade-off here to represent at that level. Otherwise, to go more granular, it has like computational trade-offs and takes more time for these runs and things like that. So
Totally.
I have,
Yeah,
on a upcoming slide, there's a little bit more detail on the representative days that I'll be sharing. So it kind of, I'll be able to explain more, or like provide a visual representation of what days we have modeled and what those conditions are. So more information to come on that too.
Okay.
And if I could just add on this too, a lot of the reason that these are being built is because we have kind of hard coded into the modeling the local capacity requirements, the LCRs for downstate New York, as well as the increasing reserve margin over time. And those two numbers are basically built off of external analysis that we know we will probably need in the real world, like you mentioned, in like production cost modeling or an actual real world dispatch day that varies with weather and might have some extreme events. But in this modeling, it only has the one load shape, the load profile it has to hit that we implemented. And so a lot of the potential days that might be on kind of more of the outlier days that the DFERS would be dispatched towards don't necessarily happen in this modeling year, that we're looking at here, but they might happen in the real world, which necessitates the capacity. And so it's kind of another one of those modeling trade-offs. We didn't do, a 90-10 run or a whole bunch of variations in the load shapes that we implemented here. that's a potential, sensitivity, to really push these individual load shapes in different directions, or to add some variability there. But the model's really just solving for the load shape we put in. And this is the dispatch it needs, but to solve for the local capacity requirements and the reserve margin, it actually needs additional capacity in certain areas.
Yeah, thanks for that, Skylar. And just, want to recognize, this is the capacity expansion model, and it gives a good estimate of, generation, but can certainly understand the importance of getting even more granular to that in something like a production cost model. So I certainly hear the feedback there.
Yeah, no, I know that was one of your recommendations too for the next phase. Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Julia?
Yeah, thank you. I have a quick question, and I'm sorry to go backwards, but just on slide 3, there's a note that says new and retrofit hydropower combustion turbines are the only candidate for DFERS. And I remember from a previous EPAC meeting, it was determined that these would be fuel cells, or we had discussion around that. So I just wanted to confirm if that's like a combustion turbine or if they would be via fuel cells.
Yes, so for this scenario 1, we're just being consistent with the assumptions and integration analysis, and we're using combustion in, combined cycle turbines or combustion turbines themselves. For scenario 3, we're only allowing fuel cells to be used as the DFER in that scenario. So you are right. We have a whole scenario developed that only allows fuel cells to be built. So that will be reflected probably in a few weeks whenever we get to presenting results from scenario 3.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I think we have one more question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Kofi representing ACE New York. Radhika is not here today, so I'll be speaking on her behalf. Looking at the results here, a conclusion I'm driving is we need 15 terawatt hours of storage to operate in 2040. And if you do some simple math, that's about 5% of the total energy. In the ballpark, does that meet the team's expectation? I was expecting something much higher for a grid that is operating under zero emission rule. So I would ask for more clarification on why we believe 5% of the energy coming from storage is sufficient for the 2040 goals. Thank you.
I guess I can take that just for my personal reaction. So one of the things that we're, I think, more interested in, instead of the energy that's been output through the storage devices over the course of the year, the thing that we typically find more interesting in is to look at that top table and see what's the total installed capacity of storage over the course of the year related to the annual peak. And so in 2040, we have about 15.7 gigawatts of storage installed in a system that has a 45 gigawatt peak. So it's like a 30% of the peak capacity need is storage in that year. There's some calculations that have to be done based on the reliability analysis and the effective load carrying capacity of that storage. So that's not necessarily, you can't just drop 15.7 gigawatts of storage into the system and expect to get a 1-to-1 reduction in that peak, because that peak might be 5 or 6 hours long or something like that. But just for reference, that on that single peak hour, storage is roughly 33% of the peak. In terms of the energy dispatch, we have a lot of energy on the system, and it's typically better in these really high renewable systems to try to let as much of that solar and wind get delivered directly to load as possible without having it to go through that energy losing translation of going through a storage device. And so there's a lot of shoulder days where the storage will operate very, very minimally. And so that kind of reduces the amount of energy that you can really get out of the storage. And just to set kind of a higher bound there, if you have a 4-hour storage system that charges and then discharges once a day, at most it could really provide like 16% of the whole energy system, even if it was sized to the maximum capacity. So I think 5% of the total energy coming out of the storage devices makes sense. And I think we actually have a pretty significant total megawatt build out of storage as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that team will have to take it back. My take is it's low because there'll be a lot of hours in a year where you would have over generation. And remember, we are operating under net interchange zero scenario. So I would expect that we need a lot of storage capacity on the grid to absorb the over generation scenarios, right? And shift it to when the renewables are not operating, or the nuclear is always running, but when the renewables are not running. So I still believe and feel that 5% is on the low end. So I think it's going to be good to dig in some more detail on the over generation periods. When I say over generation, I'm talking about probably February, March, April timeframe. I think that's when wind will be very high, likely offshore wind will be very high, and we'll start to get some solar peaking as well, while load is low because not a lot of AC units will be running and not a lot of heating will be going on. So it gives me a pause to see 5% of energy coming from storage. But yeah, so I'll be interested to see more details on that.
Sure. Yeah. We are also using some of that curtailed energy in like seasonal shifting by making hydrogen with it. So that's one other use for that low, over generation that you mentioned. And there's also just a maximum storage capability of these resources. I think we have a slide later on that shows the average duration or the total number of each type of duration of resource that's being added. But the vast majority of the resources being added are 4-hour duration resources. And so if you have like 4 or 5 days straight with low peaks and high over generation, you can only really charge that battery once, and you might not really have a time to discharge it that makes economic sense. And so there's a chance that 36 to 48 hour over generation period, you only charge for the first 4. And then a lot of those other hours are either making hydrogen or just being curtailed. Or exported. So that's just something we will have to look into when we get more of the granular results, because a lot of what I was thinking when you were talking was maybe some of this is hidden by the fact that we're still looking at like a high level zonal statewide information, and a lot of the more granular site specific or utility area specific results might change that estimate.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. You could see hydrogen is very low, so probably not going to be hydrogen. So I think it might be pointing to just overall high level of curtailment or high level of export to our neighbors instead of storing it in New York. But yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I saw Bill's hand come up too.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Skylar. I just wanted to follow up on Kobe's question a little bit. I think your explanations all make conceptual sense, Skylar. I'm wondering from the modeling perspective. I guess my understanding was that the modeling wasn't going as deep as your explanations are going. So it is correct, and I just want to test this. That so far this modeling is still single day, 13 representative days. And so all of these considerations of whether you're going to store and discharge the next day to use curtailed renewables is really still at a kind of superficial phase in the model, it sounds like, which I don't want that to sound negative. I realize it's hard to do. And so I'm just looking for opportunities for future improvement as we have these conversations as well. So I wanted to just test, the idea of building in a fulsome, using curtailed energy and storing it for later, and those pieces. Is that something that still should be improved in the model in the next cycle?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a great point, and this is something that I think we would want to improve in the future. What we have now is not a super granular look at storage. We do have kind of a storage decision making in the model that's kind of reflected of kind of single day thinking. The model still sees across multiple days and can choose like how it wants to use the storage, but it basically has to begin every day with zero generation, like a zero state of charge with storage, and choose when or if to charge that day and discharge that day. And so you're right, like we don't have in the capacity expansion model the ability to really have those like multi-day decisions and all that type of seasonal balancing or anything like that. It's really just making decisions, the best available decisions on those days, and that definitely is something we'd want to improve in the future.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for the discussion.
Yeah, this is Radha Surya from Invenergy representing IPNIM. A question about offshore wind. In 2030, I see that it's around 6,900, almost 7,000, and in 2035, it's 9,000. With the recent developments in New York, do you think we will be, this assumption stays valid still with the generation in the queue?
Yeah, so my take on that question is yes, I believe there are the resources in the queue to get close to that number by 2035. I'm pretty sure that up to 2030, all of the megawatts that are listed there as part of that 6,990 are contracted resources. So resources that are set to come online. So real named projects. And then I think there are some additional real projects that come online after 2030 that come close to this, but I also don't want to speculate on whether this can be met because I know sometimes things with these contracts change. So just adding that caveat there.
Yeah, and the state scenario is designed to model the achievement of the goals to see what transmission is required in the scenarios where we are successful. If we miss by a year or something in modeling frameworks, the required transmission is still needed. It just be needed a year or two later. What we're trying to determine here is like if we're successful with hitting these targets, what do we need to enable them to kind of maximize the probability of that achievement. So that's not really the speculation on those, like how likely individual projects are, don't really come into play here.
Thank you.
Definitely something for us to evaluate when we're coming up with the specific projects and thinking about approving specific investments. But in the capacity expansion modeling, it's just taking a fixed look at the resources available to hit those targets.
Yeah, I agree, Chittola. The reason I asked is, if the target is not met on OSW, what other resources might come into play? That was what I was thinking. But I understand what you're saying, that these resources are already targeted and they're contracted. That's what I hear. That's good.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So if for example, we're 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind behind, but we still need that energy from somewhere, what would have filled in? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a sensitivity you might want to think about. That's all I was thinking.
Thank you. I think we're good to go, Kevin.
Cool. All right. Thanks for the questions. So now getting into the zonal results that we have here. First, before getting even more granular, we have a view of the resources from an upstate versus downstate perspective. And in these charts that I'm going to be showing here, this is the cumulative capacity additions. So it's only the resources that are added to the model, and it's both the combination of resources that are contracted, so more like firm capacity that's going to be coming online, and also capacity additions that are chosen by the model and seen as economic. So it's like economic builds that are part of these total numbers that are shown here. So we can see a lot of, by 2040, 2042 timeframe, a lot of solar resources and land-based wind being built upstate in zones A through F, whereas downstate in G through K, you've got a lot of offshore resources, and then the hydrogen differs. And, as discussed earlier, a lot of that is driven by LCR requirements. And then we have a distribution of the storage resources, both upstate and downstate. And then when we get into the zonal level here, this is what the breakdown looks like. And again, this is driven by the inputs, the cost inputs here. And, specifically when we see a lot of resources in zone E, particularly for solar there, that's driven by, the economics of the resource in that zone. According to our input assumptions, there's a lot of cheap solar available to be built in this zone. And then in addition, the solar gets spread out among the other zones, particularly F, and all others here. But, just as a reminder, as more resources come online and as more generation comes onto the system, you have an effect from the headroom constraint. So, where zone E may have a lot of cheap solar resources available, according to our supply curve input, as more resources are added, there's the factor of headroom that is accounted for, and that ends up leading to a broader distribution of resources among these zones. So just wanted to highlight that a bit here. And then from a downstate perspective, you can see the distribution of the hydrogen resources as well as the battery, and the battery is seen as optimal in zone J, and I think a lot of that is driven by the LCR.
Yeah, we have a question from Bill.
Yeah, actually, a whole bunch of questions, but good stuff.
One at a time. One at a time.
So one at a time. Could you go back one slide just to?
Sure thing. Yep.
So I'm just looking at the 2030 numbers, and it's a little hard to see the very small sliver of G through K for storage, but it looks like you're about 80% upstate and 20% downstate on storage in 2030, maybe even less than 20%. And that's substantially different from the analysis that was done by NYSERDA and DPS for the roadmap for energy storage. And so I'm wondering about what were the drivers, and if you could comment on that delta.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not very familiar with that NYSERDA analysis. So I do not have much that I can really add on that point there.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's just something we might want to reference back and forth at a later date, just to do a little sanity check.
Yeah.
The other questions I had, now if you go back to the slide you were on, going forward a slide.
Yep.
So I was also so two questions. One is for the hydrogen here, are most of these retrofits of existing plants? I think that was what it said on the previous slide. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Bill. And I have a little bit more detail and then
Okay.
before you start.
So in that case, you're not so much picking. I mean, the how does the model do that? They have a price to retrofit a general plant, and they know how many plants are in each zone, and they're. I mean, is there more gradation? I mean, clearly you've got to have the plants there to retrofit. So
Yeah, there are some assumptions on how much capacity within the zone can be retrofit. And there's like a constraint within the model that says, we can't build retrofit units until the existing capacity has retired. And
Yep.
just, that's based on age. It's an age-based retirement within this model. So it doesn't build retrofits without those going offline first.
Yep. Okay. And then my last question is around the 15% headroom adder. I'm a little surprised by the lack of storage in GHI, especially when I look at E, for instance, having probably 10 times the hosting capacity cost if you've got this 15% on 22 gigawatts compared to 2 gigawatts in H and I. I would have thought that would have skewed at least some of it to GHI, especially because of the higher capacity prices in GHI. Any thoughts on that?
I have a couple of thoughts on this, as well as the similarity to the energy storage roadmap. So just to start here, the way that the headroom is being implemented in terms of needing to increase the headroom, there's kind of like an hourly matching of the kind of injection impact of all these resources. And so based on the operation of how storage is working, it might not have that same one-to-one need for buying additional headroom. And so that could actually end up almost hiding a bunch of storage in those zones to help integrate those renewables without really having to absorb all that extra cost to build additional headroom. So we try to be realistic there, because that's kind of how it would happen in the real world. Storage is not going to be injecting at low load, requiring additional expansion of the system, and it's not supposed to be adding to peaks. And so we try to represent that here, so it's not necessarily adding to that. But the other thing is, like in our nested capacity zone that we have here in our modeling, it's almost always cheaper, and this is just mostly a figment of the modeling that we've had in most of our modeling frameworks. GH&I models almost always skip over them because the prices aren't quite as good as J, the value isn't quite as good as J. It's slightly less expensive, but it's still more expensive than A through F. And so it's kind of this dead zone where storage just really isn't constructed in those zones very much. But I wouldn't read too much into that because we know this, and so we would interpret this more as F through K or G through K is kind of a representation of what we think the model wants downstate, and there might be kind of a hair's breadth between building in G or building the next increment in zone J. So that's just kind of how we're thinking about it. It's really just from the model. And then just, the reason it's building, quote unquote, building hydrogen in GH&I, but it's not building storage, is because it's not actually building hydrogen in zone GH&I. This is those retrofits once again, and the model doesn't really have much of a cost to just kind of snap its fingers and say, this unit now does not burn natural gas, it burns hydrogen, and we have all of that cost being built into the going forward costs. So like it's a higher fuel cost, it's higher operational cost, all the other costs going forward are higher, but there's no like capital cost on day one for those retrofits in the modeling. That's definitely something that could be changed potentially in future modeling frameworks, but to be consistent with the integration analysis, we use that. So in GH&I, it's not that it's necessarily choosing to buy hydrogen combustion units instead of buying storage. It's basically just choosing to snap its fingers and enable these things to burn hydrogen instead of constructing brand new storage with all the costs that come with that.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Skylar. It explains a lot. Just to maybe if you further explain how the model is doing the headroom for storage now. So I think we talked many meetings ago about, and I'm glad you guys. It sounds like you've incorporated some of the actual operating characteristics of the storage into the headroom analysis that it can actually improve it.
Yeah.
Can you put more texture around how it's actually doing that now?
I think so, but I might have to, hop back out of the pool and ask somebody else to take over. I'm not sure, maybe Sarah or Kevin, but the way we, I think, determined to put the headroom into the capacity expansion model was to look at kind of an hourly energy headroom impact. So we have this kind of total available headroom on an hourly basis that the model can see. And if you're adding more solar that's injecting during these times, it's going to basically, it's the same profile. You can't shift it. It keeps delivering, the same generation profile during the same hours. And it's basically just incremental. You can just keep adding that together. And that's the total impact to the headroom. But on storage, that's not the case. The actual impact of storage is dependent on when it's charging and when it's discharging to determine which might be driving the headroom. And a lot of the headroom binding hours are actually low load hours. And so it's mostly the charging of storage that would be impacting those headroom hours. And same with kind of the opposite side of things, where it's middle of the day when the solar is really injecting. It's using that headroom to inject, but storage might be actually reducing the impact of the system by charging during those times. In some instances, it might be injecting at the same time as solar is injecting at peak times, and then it'll have a different impact. But my understanding is that we have kind of this hourly kind of matching process, and it's kind of like takes the worst hour where you're having the most impact on headroom, and that's kind of your headroom impact, and then it sums up over the course of the year to figure out if you need more headroom, and then you buy it if you need it. And it's kind of taking these decisions on an incremental basis. I hope that made sense and didn't make it actually more confusing.
It actually made a lot of sense, and I don't want to go way into the weeds. The only thing that didn't make sense was the last statement about summing up over the year. I would think that it would be the maximum for that hour, at any time, it's
Yes,
more
the
of a
maximum
capacity.
impact. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
got it. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Skylar.
Yep. And then I think the last question, Kevin, could you go back one slide to the 2040 numbers? Just on a zonal basis. So the big difference here between like the storage roadmap and this modeling is that this has a dramatically higher load in 2030 because of the large loads and additional electrification. And so when we are trying to hit those loads, we end up going with even more solar upstate in those early years than we had previously. And trying to balance the new much higher peaks and the full integration of solar upstate, we see kind of like an economic shift of maybe 20 or 30% of the storage that would have been downstate is now swinging upstate. So that tells us that the kind of competition between upstate and downstate storage, that's a really narrow economic decision. So it could kind of go either way because, a increase in load and a slight higher build out of solar upstate swings a lot of those megawatts upstate. And so we're right on that threshold where if we have a slightly lower, load and impact of those, very large loads coming in upstate, maybe we have less solar built upstate. Maybe that means the storage swings back downstate. So I'd focus more on the total quantity of storage, which is very, very similar in most of the years to the total build out of storage in the storage roadmap. It's just those specific zonal breakdowns are actually apparently very sensitive. We're kind of like right on an inflection point, it seems, and they're very sensitive to the load and the solar build out in different regions of the state. But I agree with you. I think it's not. It does not necessarily quote unquote agree with a lot of our previous modeling frameworks to say there's only going to be maybe 1 gigawatt of storage out of 6 or 7 by 2030 being downstate. But this is just what the model's saying about trying to hit that 70 by 30 and getting hourly matching of those large loads.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So this is getting into the headroom that the model chooses to build. So, as Skylar mentioned earlier, as we get into the
Well,
later
I'd like to
years
say,
of
I
the
f-
model.
Is there a way to go? I feel like we rushed through that third slide and then didn't actually get. All right, sorry.
No worries.
This one and then one right before we went to. I just had a question about this slide before we move on. I can hold it or I could ask it now.
No, absolutely. We're ready
All
for
right.
it.
Okay, so we are looking at a lot of hydrogen in zone J. I guess my question is, to the extent, I mean, this is basically the plants that say they're going to retire minus, I presume, the the peakers that have to retire in 2030, that then I guess just come back as retrofits. So in theory, these plants, I mean, we know where they are, correct?
Yes, that's
So-
correct.
So I just would, is there a way to see or, have that information? I'm really concerned because I'm seeing all this retrofits in J and, clearly, I can only presume that that'll be a lot of presumed retrofits in disadvantaged communities, and we haven't talked about sort of what the CLCPA's obligations to disadvantaged communities are at this phase with regard to this piece. We've talked about its application later in the process, but I think there's a lot we should be looking out for now. So is there a way, can we get that information by location?
So I think all we have at this stage is the zonal results, the generator information that's in that's a publicly available document. That's the New York ISO Gold Book. It tells you, what generators are where. That is
That's
right,
what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's all
So-
summed up into a zonal quantity of both combined cycle resources and combustion turbines.
Well,
And those
yeah,
are the
but
two.
that's my point, is that we know where they are.
Yeah,
So we should be
I'm getting
looking
there.
at, we should have, we know where they are, we know where the disadvantaged communities are, so we should be able to have some type of analysis that shows the communities that are going to be impacted. I mean, affected. I mean, clearly I can go into the, I get that it's rolled up for this purpose, but it was rolled up from discoverable info.
Yes,
It'd be helpful to
I'm
have
getting there.
that without me having to do that independently.
Yeah, no, I was trying to kind of build the story and get to the conclusion.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So we built it up because the capacity expansion model, to keep all that information on a nodal basis would be such a tremendous computational effort that the model, like the computers wouldn't solve. We would need an ungodly amount of servers to solve that. So for this stage one, to just sum up the total energy needs and the capacity to match that energy, we've done a zonal basis. And so that's what these are. And I would also point out that these are just capacity. These are not the actual hydrogen usage or the combustion happening there. These are just the megawatt available to potentially use hydrogen. And then for these high level zonal results, stage 2 is doing that exact disaggregation that you're talking about, where we go back and we peel all the layers back, look back at the utility specific information, where these plants are, which plants the model is saying probably retrofit in what year. And that siting methodology, which we're going to get to after this presentation, that siting methodology is where we're going to be able to say things like, okay, so this batch of resources turns 60 and needs to retire in 2035. And we only have combustion turbines burning hydrogen as our option right now, but it's in a disadvantaged community. So we're going to kind of move this other retirement or this other facility that's a retrofit, we're going to move that forward and do it over there instead, because we're not going to be doing new combustion in disadvantaged communities. So those types of decisions will happen in stages 2 through 4 through the siting methodology of like translating what you said, this all rolled up information. When we disaggregate that back out, stage 2 is when we're going to be making those decisions about, well, do we actually literally site this megawatt of new hydrogen combustion in this disadvantaged community or not?
I do understand that. It wasn't that I was asking for the nodal analysis now. It's that I'm thinking there's sort of a very common sense, you know, maybe parallel question that can be answered. And again, it seems like something that would be helpful, informative, and not that time intensive to have. We know where these plants are, right? And we know where the disadvantaged communities are without rolling it up on a nodal basis. We could just even have a list that says, you know, these are the plans, these where they are, and this is where we're expected to have the capacity. Like that would be a very user-friendly thing for somebody like myself to be able to use to tell other people what's going on with the hydrogen.
So are you asking for like the existing resources, combustion resources in a given zone? You want a list of those resources that we're asking for?
Yeah, by location.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that information, obviously, it exists in the Gold Book. We can try to figure out a way to present it in maybe
Yeah,
a
that's
more
exactly what I
user-friendly
mean. Like
way.
it would be helpful because it's by location, but it's very easy. It exists in the Gold Book. It's a list. And I mean, and it can be listed out by location, which can be very easily mapped to where the disadvantaged communities are. But it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't seem like a super labor intensive thing.
No, I think you're right. And I think we may have something available already on this. You know, we have the Gold Book we've already mentioned, but we have the Just Transition Working Group put together that list.
Yeah, no, I've got
spreadsheet
that
of,
list, but
okay.
it's what it doesn't, well, unless, because I've looked at that list and the list is a list, but it's not arranged. It's not matched up by location. Or,
Okay.
I mean, you can, if one wants to look at basically one needs to be able to look at it, figure out where they are and then group them by where they are and look and see which ones are in disadvantaged communities. I've looked at that. I mean, it's like a couple steps, but I think it would be something that would be helpful for folks like myself to be able to, people ask me, well, what's going on, in terms of capacity, where is this going to happen and how is that match disadvantaged communities? I could be like, here.
Yeah, and then I think the only other resource we might have is something we developed as part of the storage roadmap where we did map kind of all the resources with low capacity factors onto a map of the disadvantaged communities. So Julia just posted something. Oh yeah, this might actually exist. It looks like New York City may have taken, what we did in the storage roadmap. They may actually done something bigger and more broad to actually look at those facilities and where they actually are. So we'll look at that, and if that doesn't answer the question, we can discuss maybe how to visualize, the existing facilities a little bit better.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions on this zonal slide? I know this is new information and important, so I want to make sure I take those before moving on. All right, thank you very much. So this is starting to get into the details of headroom. And I think I mentioned it just a bit ago, but just to highlight again, and as Skylar mentioned earlier, by the later years of this modeling horizon, we can see that most of the zones start to build out headroom, and that's when that cost adder really comes into play. And so the dark blue bar is what is considered as existing headroom. And that was measured by the joint utilities and provided as an input assumption. And then we have this incremental headroom, which is represented by the hashed bar here. And that is the headroom that the model chooses to add.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is exactly what I was mentioning earlier. This is the perfect representation of it. You'll see that every zone, besides Zone H, which didn't have additional large-scale renewables to choose in order to build more headroom, all the other zones by 2040 have had to increase their headroom. So like it basically got us back to a situation as if there was no headroom incremental cost anyway, because every zone had the same cost. So that's why we had to make a change here.
Are there any questions on this before I keep going?
Just to make sure I really understand how the 15% was done. This is Bill Acker again. So for zone J, you're only adding about 1 gigawatt of incremental headroom. So that's done at the headroom cost because it's only 1 gigawatt. And for zone E in 2040, you're adding what about 6 or 7 gigawatts, call it. So that's done at 15% increments for all the 7. So at least a factor or 2 higher than the zone J headroom cost. Do I understand this correctly?
Yes, I think so.
Good. Yep. Thank you.
Yep, and that really is gets us finally back to a point where the model can actually choose that. It's choosing maybe a $1,600 per kilowatt increment of solar, but instead of $389 a kilowatt of headroom, now it has to pay like $500, $600, $700 per kilowatt, and that new cost, in some instances, is actually still cheaper than another zone plus the original 389. So it's you see how it's making that decision, and it goes beyond 1 gigawatt in like zone A and C and D as well. So it keeps having to make those decisions on an annual basis.
Excellent. Thanks for the question. I'm gonna keep going unless anything else comes up. So these next 2 slides are just to provide a little bit more information on storage and the hydrogen build. So kind of breaking that down, we have it at the NICA level at a generic storage and hydrogen level, but this is showing the storage resources by their duration. So we have both 4-hour and 8-hour as candidates in the model. And this is showing, what the storage builds look like by 2042. And the dark sort of pink color here is the 4-hour storage, whereas the dashed bar is the 8-hour. And the 8-hour storage comes online in 2040, whereas the 4-hour is kind of spread across the entire modeling horizon here. So.
And these are both still done with the 0 state of charge at the beginning of the day. So the use case for a 4-hour storage is that, or a use case would be solar generates a lot in the afternoon. It doesn't do anything in the morning before you have over capacity, but after the afternoon, you've got a lot of solar power, and then it's discharging in the night. The 8-hour, the same scenario that it's 0 state of charge at the beginning of the day. The reason why I'm going here is I suspect that is a very weak use case for 8-hour compared to other use cases, just so we understand how it's modeled.
Yes, Bill, you're right about how it's modeled there.
Yeah, because it's going to be pretty rare that you're going to need 8 hours after your afternoon peak, whereas if it could do the next morning or something, it might be more valuable.
Yep, and a lot of the 8-hour storage is also driven by like the ELCC and the need for reliable capacity in those later years. By that time, the upstate ELCC of storage has degraded a bit, so that 8-hour storage, even if it's not operated, on a day-to-day use case, as you were mentioning, even if it's not operated as much, it's there as kind of the cheapest available new reliable capacity, even if it just sits still and isn't operated for over the course of the day. So if it gets to operate, to make the actual day-to-day meeting the load shape a little bit more cost effective. It'll do that too, but some of this I would expect is actually just being built to be a very close to zero capacity factor reliability resource.
Interesting. That makes sense. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Were there any other questions? I thought I saw a hand up. Perhaps not, though. All right. And so this is getting into more detail on the hydrogen builds here. And so you can see the retrofits versus what is new. The solid purple is the new hydrogen, whereas all of the other resources are retrofits. And we've had some conversations around Zone J. All of the hydrogen that's coming in that zone is retrofit, whereas we get some new builds in GH and I. So. And we also wanted to provide some information on the electrolysis load. So just a reminder, the electrolysis is able to be built within zones A through E. And this is how that breaks down on a zonal basis over time. And the model has the ability to choose where the electrolysis load is being built. And so we can see a lot of that going into zone C, and then also spread amongst the other zones here. And then finally, what we have here is the model generation on the representative days, and this is in the year 2042. So this is where this is like how the capacity expansion model is seeing both the load and the generation that it is using to meet that load. So it's kind of like a under the hood view of what the capacity expansion model is seeing. And we have provided it at 2042, but just as a note, there is more information for other years, the prior years in our appendix here. So I'm not going to walk through all of those in detail, but just wanted to highlight that that's there. And these slides are posted on the EPAC website. But, and also this is a pretty busy slide. There's another slide here, slide 20, where I kind of provided an overview of these representative days slides, and it talks about how to interpret these and what some of this labeling means, but I'll go ahead and walk through that a bit now. So we have 13 representative days, and we have the summer peak as well as summer near peak. We have winter peak and winter near peak. And then we have a combination of different system conditions that we have represented. So for example, LELSLW, that means low energy, low solar, and low wind. And so how we come up with these days is we have sort of a statistical model that does this calculation and comes up with this representation. But, it's important for us when we do this capacity expansion to look at, a system condition where things are low, but also system conditions that are high, like high energy, high solar, high wind. And what does that look like? And then basically everything in between there. So like, what if energy is low, solar is low, but the wind is high? And so we have, a bunch of different conditions represented here. And the black line here is system load. And then in addition to that, you can see how load is added when charging is occurring. And that's what's represented by the black dashed line. and that's charging from batteries, but also load that's happening from electrolysis. And then we have also flexible EV loads that are represented within the model. And that is represented by the purple or pink dashed line. So where when solar is high, you're able to flex, the model is able to flex some of that EV charging load into the daytime when the solar is high and flex it out of the peak periods or into the evening and reduce the peak load with that feature. So I know that was a lot to go over, but is there any questions that I can address on this information?
Yeah, Kevin, Bill Acker again. So the one thing I would highly question here is the assumption that the hydrogen is going to get generated on the peak days. It seems like that's not a realistic assumption. I don't think anybody would, if your hydrogen's capacity factor is a couple percent at best, you certainly don't want to be making the hydrogen on the summer and winter peak days. So I'm wondering if you ought to consider, I mean, this is obviously the challenge with having just a daily model, 1-day models, but I think it would be very reasonable to assume that you're going to make your hydrogen, which can be stored nearly indefinitely, at days that are not, the grid's not stressed. So I'm wondering if you ought to go back and rerun this with an assumption that you dropped your hydrogen generation on high load days either to 0 or to some much smaller number, and see if that has much of an impact. I mean, that might be just a quick sensitivity you could do.
Yeah, Bill, that's really interesting, and that's one of the first things that came into my mind the first time I saw these as well. I think my first question was, why are we increasing the peaks? Because that net load, when you're talking about adding electrolysis and charging, taking away flex load, the new peak is still higher in some instances than the regular peak, but it's really driven, as you can see, probably by that solar production and the zonal constraints that we have. So we have this huge build out of solar, like 90% of it being in a few zones upstate. And even on the peak days, there's many hours where they are generating far more energy than the needs of that zone. And so the model has to choose what to do with that. And like you said, you're probably more likely to be charging batteries so you can then use it in that zone on a peak day. But this is actually a trade-off that the model's making. The trade-off is build more storage capacity to charge the storage, but in those upstate zones, that storage is coupled to the zone. The storage now doesn't really have anything to do because there's plenty of energy in that zone already. That storage can't really discharge in that zone because you don't really need the energy in that zone. You need the energy in other zones. And that's where that decoupling of hydrogen is really kind of exciting and kind of beneficial to the model, where you can make the hydrogen in upstate and then you're using it and delivering it to downstate. And so that's why you even have a hydrogen production on a peak day, because it's a quote unquote peak day in terms of load, but there's still plenty of energy in upstate New York to do that. And it's really more of a constraint downstate where you actually need hydrogen. So I hope that makes sense, but I see this more as a transmission, like flagging transmission constraints, than the model making bad decisions, just because of the amount of solar build out that we have.
Well, that makes some sense, Skylar, but I guess I'm still a little concerned that, if you have a hydrogen unit that has a capacity factor of say 5%, and you have an electrolysis device supplying the hydrogen for that hydrogen unit has a capacity factor of 5%, and the electrolysis unit is running with a capacity factor much, much higher than 5%. There's no reason you'd size the electrolysis unit anywhere near the power you'd size it to run most of the year. You would be running the electrolysis unit at 1/20th of your output of your generation. So when I look at a peak day, it doesn't make any sense to me that I'm seeing hydrogen electrolysis loads that are anywhere near the levels I'm seeing here, even if you don't decide not to run on the peak days. And I would argue that no electrolysis unit wants to run on peak days just because of the price of electricity. They're going to turn off. So, I think it's much more realistic that the electrolysis drops clear out of this model on your single day looks. So it does seem like it's not just a transmission question, it's also a modeling question that we really should do a sensitivity and look at dropping the hydrogen electrolysis way down, because you're the whole beauty, as you just said, is for like the hydrogen is you got to make it slowly over time in different places and move it around. You're not going to tie it to the peak days.
Right, but the peak day production of electrolysis is lower than the rest of it's maybe for 1 or 2 modeling blocks, and these are averaged together. So we do see a lot more electrolysis in, like, say, those first 4 or 5 days on the left that have much higher weights, and a little bit less, and it's all upstate, using that, potentially curtailed solar is being turned into electrolysis. And then in the last 4 representative days, you have a lot more hydrogen usage, and almost all of that is downstate. So I see what you're saying. I'm trying to figure out how to make that make sense, that we need to stop that. But I'm still not quite understanding why we would need to stop, the ability of the model to, in areas of the state where it has extra energy, even on peak days, we would not let it use it for electrolysis.
Well, what is the assumption for hydrogen? Is it like the batteries that you generate on the day you need it, or are you
No,
banking hydrogen?
that's it can actually be made anytime. But at
Okay.
this point, the model is showing you what it's chosen, what days it's chosen to make it at what levels.
Okay. And it's choosing based on economic on cost of energy.
Yes, it's choosing like the megawatt hours. There's like a cost to make that based on available energy in zones. So it's still citing like a quote unquote electrolysis unit, like a megawatt of electrolysis. It's still citing that in zones. And I think maybe 1 or 2 slides ago, Kevin had that table to show exactly where the electrolyzers are being built. And then you can kind of look at that matched up with the capacity build out in the model to see like what's really serving that load in those hours in those zones. And it really, the conclusion I've come to so far is that, even on those peak days, we have such a tremendous build out of solar power in certain zones, that it's really, it comes down to being kind of a locational energy question, where even kind of locationally fixed storage can't help you anymore. You really need something that can decouple the energy charging and then the discharging, and hydrogen is providing that service for us today.
So the model is doing an economic dispatch with the electrolyzers.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's basically considered 100% flexible. It can just like soak up the power whenever the model thinks it's best.
But modeling a cost of energy that goes with that soaking up the power.
There is a cost. So it's not going to really use it if it's not needed. It doesn't. Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the model is going to just make extra hydrogen if it's not planned at some point during the year to end up being used in the DFERS, because it's kind of like an iterative process where we figure out what amount of hydrogen is needed in the model, and then the model cycles through and makes that amount of hydrogen where and when it's most economic.
Yes, I would agree with that, Skylar.
Yeah, it's kind of circular, so it's been a little bit of a challenge, because it takes like at least 2, maybe 3 cycles of the model to come to that conclusion, because you have to kind of figure out, based on the cost estimate of creating all the hydrogen, how much DFER capacity you should build and how much you're actually going to run it. But then you have to make sure that that amount of hydrogen was generated over the course of the year. And if it wasn't, the model has to kind of go back through and make sure it can make that amount, increase electrolysis, or make some trade-offs, or reduce defers, like if it's not making that much. So it's kind of like this iterative circular process to kind of come to a conclusion about the amount of defers and the amount of hydrogen that have to be created.
Hey
Yeah.
everyone, this is Sarah Karkner from the NISO. I just wanted to speak up here and clarify. In our model, we actually don't have an iterative approach. It's all solved simultaneously, where it co-optimizes the amount of electrolysis it needs and, you know, hydrogen powered defers. So we do have constraints set up that make sure that that is equal. But to Skylar's point, just wanted to confirm it won't build more electrolysis than is needed. It's all set up so that it will balance that out for what it needs for the rest of economy hydrogen and hydrogen to supply the hydrogen powered defers. But it is just all in one run, and it co-optimizes all of it with the build cost and the operating cost needed.
Co-optimizing is a much better word. Sorry, I
Yeah.
was trying
Nope.
trying to get to that sense, but I used the word iterative, which could imply like stopping the model and rerunning it again.
Yeah, but just to
Great,
be really
thanks,
clear,
Skylar.
Sarah, I just want to make sure I really understand. So the model is running. You're solving for a representative day. Is the model having to build and supply the hydrogen from the electrolyzer on that representative day?
No, it does not have to happen on the same day. And so just to take it a step back, we solve all 20 years of the study period at the same time. So it co-optimizes for the entire 20-year study period. And in terms of the electrolysis load and hydrogen demand balance, that's on an annual basis. And then it knows that it has representative days to choose from. And in terms of the hydrogen production and electrolysis load, that does not need to balance on a daily basis, but on an
Okay,
annual
good.
basis. Whereas a battery, for comparison, does have to balance on a day because of state of charge and the way that that is configured.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Radha Surya from Invenergy representing GIPNI. I have a couple of questions. I know this, sorry for my ignorance for asking these questions, but what is the weight you're representing here? And it varies in a different ways across the graph. What is that weight?
Yes, good question. So the weight here is how we input these representative days into the model is, you know, the weight essentially corresponds to the number of days within a year that are roughly at this system condition. So for example, the peaks are only 1 day per year. And then we have near peak days that are, you know, we've represented as 5 additional days around that condition. But then the other weights, you know, looking at this low energy, low solar, low wind condition, there's roughly like 100 days that we've mapped to be roughly within this condition. So essentially the weights boil down to the days within a year that are roughly equivalent to that.
Okay, with that condition, like let's start with the low condition on all the generation, right? So when you're representing this block here on top, it's the 8760 run, or it is 101 days. What is it representing then?
Well, essentially we have taken 8760 data and we've had to reduce that down into these representative days in order to get the model to compute the answer for us. But so the model ends up seeing only these 13 separate days, and it makes its capacity expansion decisions based on this information here. So it's a way that we've had to take 8760 information and put it in a format that the model will run for us, essentially.
So these are, you said 13 different days, but 13 different scenarios. So I'm trying to understand what my x-axis is actually here, right? So what is each dot represented? Like the output is on the y-axis, the megawatt output. On the x-axis, what is it?
Yes, great question. That is not super clear here. So like each day is like each block here represents a 24-hour period.
Okay.
But as I was sort of mentioned earlier, there's different blocks of time within each day, and that's why it's sort of lumpy here. Because it's not doing exactly the 24 hours, it's doing like 6-hour chunks. And again, that's another way to overcome like computational challenges. So, but the x-axis is hours in a day.
24 hours in a day with the chunks of 6. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. So I have a question on the hydrogen, and I know Bill will like this. On 13, if you go to slide 13, I'm trying to see how it is currently distributed and see Dune J has most of the retrofit hydrogen and both CTs and CCs, right? And that is almost 6 gigawatt. What is the total capacity of Dune J?
The total capacity of these retrofits, or you mean just like in general?
The load is
Like
Yeah,
peak load in Zone J is usually a little over 10 gigawatts, maybe a bit more by the
right.
end of that modeling period.
Yeah, Shaila, I think you might understand where I'm going. If you have 6 gigawatt on hydrogen, how would be other generation balancing out against this? That's what I was thinking. Is it like these are the CCs which are existing and then they would be turned into retrofitted, right? That's what the assumption meant. That means most of the coal is or whatever thermal generation is down there, it's going to be there still, right? The 6 gigawatt.
Yep, it's still sitting there, retrofitted, and it has an incredibly low capacity factor throughout the course of the year. So most of the energy is coming from, imports or transmission or offshore wind or some solar, those types of things.
What's the capacity factor? That's a good point. I'm sorry. What is that?
Depending on the resource we're talking about, it's usually under like 1%, incredibly low.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So going back to 15 on that, the summer peak and winter peak, especially the winter peak, is very interesting for me. That I see a lot of hydrogen is dispatched. Can you explain this phenomena? What's happening here in the winter? The solar is low, but what is providing for the electrolysis of hydrogen so that you can have maximum output is what I was thinking.
So on that winter peak day, like the second from the right, the winter peak, that's a single day where you're right. There is, during that middle of the day, there is some electrolysis happening, but you're also seeing some hydrogen dispatched shortly after that. That's upstate having a little bit of electrolysis, but then downstate you're using the hydrogen. And then on that final chart on the right, there's actually no electrolysis on that day, on that winter
That
peak
was
day.
the one I was asking the question, Skylar.
Yeah, the farthest one on the right, there's actually no electrolysis that day. It's just, we're seeing a lot of imports and a lot of deferred generation using that hydrogen on that day.
Okay. So without electrolysis, hydrogen can run still. That's the assumption we have here, right? I'm just trying to understand how the model is interpreted.
Right, because we're building up hydrogen over the course of the year and in different zones, and then we can just use it when we need it.
Okay. It's like you have storage, some kind of storage for the hydrogen.
Right. Right, and we have those types of costs built into the cost of hydrogen in the model.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Great.
Bill, do you
Thank
have
you.
your hand up again for a new question or?
No, I didn't have a new question, Skylar. I'm sorry. It's
Okay.
a legacy, although I'm just trying to do math in the background here of
Yeah.
50% of hydrogen. It still feels like you got, if I weight your 5 gigawatts, that you got a lot of bars for like a 200 days here. It seems like you're making a lot more hydrogen than you need, but I may be off on that. You know, I mean, obviously it's an efficiency. It's only probably 25% round trip efficiency for fuel cell, electrolyzer fuel cell, but still, or motion plant. But it still feels like I want to look at it more. But thank you for the
That's a great-
explanations.
That is a great point, and I think that's something that we can take back and clarify too. I also want to clarify if that's, based on the chart, is that when the electrolyzers are actually running and they're producing that much hydrogen in that hour chunk, or is that like the maximum capability available in that hour? It'd be good to understand that a little bit more, because I agree, once you add up, on the left side, you have 101 days where you're making all that hydrogen, and then another three, and then another 79 days where you're making hydrogen in every hour. And then you don't really even use any hydrogen until those kind of later buckets. So yeah, it'd be good to match those up just to make sure we're accounting for it correctly, or at least presenting what the model's doing correctly.
Yeah, and I think I have a good answer for that here. So not only is electrolysis being added to the system when the generators are being utilized, like the hydrogen generators, we also have that assumption that there's 50% of the rest of economy hydrogen. That load is also being added to the system.
Okay.
So like it's not quite a balance of electrolysis to generation. There's also this additional electrolysis load that's there, whether or not the hydrogen units are running or not. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, I think some of that is industrial, but also high heavy duty vehicles.
That helps a lot, Kevin. That makes it seem much more plausible. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, glad that was helpful. Are there any other questions that I can address at this time? Otherwise, I am coming to the end of my slide deck here, but I just wanted to, remind folks to take a look at the appendix. There's some additional information, both on some modeling methodologies, changes that have happened to the model over time that have been discussed here at EPAC previously. Some more information on representative days, as well as that cumulative zonal build out over time. So that information is available for folks. But is there anything else that I can address at this time? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. And Skylar, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Sounds great. Thank you. I just wanted to mention, Julia had put something in the chat earlier, and I clicked on it and messed around with it, and it does give us exactly what we were looking for. If you go to the mapping tool on that link, you can actually go to that first tab all the way on the right where it says air quality on the mapping tool, and you click that little caret drop down, and you can actually select power plants under the air quality section, and it shows all the power plants overlapping with the EJ communities in New York City area, and you can even down select within those communities as well. So that's a fantastic tool. Thank you for sharing that, Julia.
Thank you. And it'd be great if we could have that for, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that's public. So please feel free to use it. And if you have my email, there's other folks in my office that put that together, but you can reach out if you have questions. I'll just put my email in the chat just in case.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I think it just would be great to have that for the whole list, not just, basically it would be helpful if we could have that for disadvantaged communities statewide in addition to New York City.
I'm gonna have to
Not
put
that New York
that
City
on,
has done this for us.
the others.
I'm not asking you, Julia. I'm
Yes,
not asking New York
understood.
City to do that. I'm asking I'm asking our modelers and folks.
Yeah.
Now that New York City's done this for us, it seems like it's a relatively easy exercise to sort of give this association for where the DACs are.
Yeah, we'll look into that for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, please take a look. Thank you. Thank you so much for uplifting this fantastic tool.
All right, so we only have about 18 minutes left, but I would at least want to get going on this presentation on the citing methodology to get people starting to think about it, so we can kind of use the next few weeks to think about it and maybe go back and forth over email with questions. We might not be able to finish this, so we'll probably have to have another EPAC meeting just for this and maybe a couple other things, but we probably were going to need one anyway. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now, I think, to walk through this, and I'm going to cut you off maybe at like 3:55 or a little bit after, so we can talk about next steps.
Okay. Yes, I'm Jeff Marr from National Grid, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to hand it right over to Evan. You want to jump right in and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. Yep, this is Evan Colsat from NYSEG and RG&E. So I'll jump into this first part of the presentation. So this is just an overview of, where we are. I can go through this pretty quickly. We just spoke about in depth on the capacity expansion modeling. So now we have to take those aggregate amounts of generation placed in each zone and move them into a nodal model, the power flow model, which contains all of the transmission elements on a detailed level. And then we place a generation into that model to determine where we need to potentially upgrade our system based on constraints that we're seeing and the congestion on the system. So we can move to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to run through some of the considerations that we took into account when putting together this siting methodology. So we start with the CGPP objective, which is to determine the least cost investment and dispatch solution. And placement within DACs is to be monitored closely throughout the analysis. We have a requirement to place the resources identified in that capacity expansion model performed by NYSO. And for example, that, as we saw previously, that's going to result in quite a large build out of renewable generation. We might have very large blocks of generation to place in specific locations. And then on a zonal basis, you saw we had upwards of almost 15 gigawatts of solar PV in Zone E. So there's quite an extensive build out that we have to take into account, potentially much larger than the amount of load that we have to serve in certain areas, which is going to result in a significant amount of congestion. So we have to factor that in this siting methodology. And that block size there of 1,200 megawatts, we'll talk a little bit more about that. They'll be smaller on the lower voltage systems. The next point here is looking at how this is initially going to develop. The first step is to look at the NYSO interconnection queue. And when we do that, one of the first questions that comes up is what proportion of the queue is going to be shed naturally as the economics become more clear. And our answer to that right now is just to model the interconnection queue projects at stage 6 or later. So those projects which are in an advanced stage of development that we're pretty confident we're going to see come onto the system in the future are the ones that we want to focus on, not to rule out ones in earlier stages, but to get a starting point. And if we jump down to that bullet at the bottom there, we do want to just note that if there's known physical feasibility considerations, we'll have to factor those in when looking at these projects and at stage 6 or later. The note also just notes that we're aware of the queue reform happening at NYSO, and we will have to account for that in this process. And then, final note on this slide is just that when we're modeling these generators, we want to simplify the models so as to not, for a single project, have 10 different generator models in the power flow model. Just simplify that into a single collector. Next slide, please. Okay, so Continuing on the interconnection queue here, the other point is to, we may want to evaluate the split between projects in the queue within each zone by voltage level, as a way to inform where generation may need to be placed. So, for example, based on the review of the NISO queue, resources beyond what's in the queue already might be placed in a given zone in this way. For example, if we saw that 40% of the queue projects were going to be placed on the 345 kV system and 60% on the lower voltage system, we could carry that same ratio forward as a way of properly accounting for where developers are interested in interconnecting on the system. Utilities in our headroom analysis focus on our local systems, but we want to make sure that we're accounting for the projects and the developer interest in the higher voltage system as well. And the final point here, I believe it's the final point, is how to consider renewables versus DFERs, and should different approaches apply. So the analogy is to use the same approach replacement in DACs, except while renewables and fuel cells may be placed in DACs, however, no new combustion units will be placed in DACs. Combustion DFERs may be placed at existing fossil combustion facilities up to their existing nameplate capacity. However, incremental capacity may not be cited in a DAC. So I think the key point there is that no new combustion units can be placed in DACs. However, existing fossil fuel units could be converted, as was mentioned in the previous presentation as well. Next slide, please. All right, yeah, a couple more points here. We wanted to put some guardrails on the size of individual projects at a single location. So there's some caveats to this, but we set a minimum block at 100 megawatts and a maximum aggregate amount at any given location of, I won't list them all out, but different megawatt values at each voltage level corresponding to the maximum amount of current that can flow on the buses at those locations. And these numbers would apply both to storage and to generation. So you could have, for example, the first one there, 600 megawatts at 115 kV. You could have 600 megawatts of generation and 600 megawatts of storage. However, you couldn't have 700 megawatts of generation and 100 megawatts of storage to offset that and bring it down to 600. So we want to keep, use that as our constraint. And then another consideration here is coordination between the utilities and developers is assumed to be perfect coordination, which means that the developers will build in the locations that you identify in the study, and then solutions will unlock the generation at those specific locations, which will then be made available to the public in stage 6 of CGPP through things such as headroom updates and other methods subject to CEII limitations. And that bullet at the bottom just is kind of a caveat to the maximum and minimum size of individual projects. We have to factor in any detailed specifics at given locations, such as resource land use and things of that nature. All right, next slide, please. I believe, yep, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk about how we're taking those considerations and putting them into a step-by-step methodology.
So this slide 7 here is the big picture. The next 3 or 4 slides kind of get into the details of what we're expecting to do. So here, from the big picture perspective, we're going to start with the interconnection queue and look at projects that are advanced into the queue and cite those as they're proposed to be cited as part of their interconnection study. Once we've included those resources in the cases, the next step is to look to consume headroom. So headroom, we heard some of that discussed in the capacity expansion modeling work. there was a filing back in February. So these headroom numbers are trying to determine where on the system there is electrical capability to support new generation. So step 2 of our process would be to use that electrical headroom. Step 3 picks up once that electrical headroom has been exhausted, and looking at stations in the area where we originally thought that there may be headroom, but when we did the calculations, that didn't really play out that way. So we think these stations may represent areas of the system where renewables are potentially able or more likely to connect. So we would move to those stations. Even though they don't have headroom, we still have to site these resources somewhere. As part of this step 3, we would also consider a connection to middle of the line, not to the station, but to the lines around the station. Step 4 is moving into areas if we still have resources to site, but we've exhausted steps 1 through 3. Again, focusing on areas where there seems to be a lot of developer interest. It's more of a judgment call. We can get into some of the details. I think Skylar is going to stop me, but maybe next time we can get into some of the details in each of these steps. And then, because then at step 4, we would use some engineering judgment. We would use some of the modeling outputs from the stage 1, the capacity expansion, just to validate that what we're seeing makes sense. But just given the amount of resources that we are going to have to cite in some of these zones, we do expect to quickly move past the interconnection queue in step 1, the headroom in step 2, the available stations in step 3 will start to become challenging in some zones. So these step 3 and step 4 will be a bit challenging, but that's, I think, Skylar, you want to maybe stop here and you can pick up next time.
Yeah, that was actually good timing. You got to a good high-level overview of the process, and we'll get into more details next time. I wanted to stop just so I could tell folks that the materials that were presented today are going to be put on the EPAC website. They were already sent around by email, so let me know if you, for some reason, did not get that email as part of the EPAC. But those will be posted online for broader use. We also obviously didn't finish this presentation. We're going to want to have some more discussions also on sensitivities to the 3 CGPP scenarios. So we're going to want to set up another EPAC meeting here in the near future. Based on staff availability and timeframes for a lot of people traveling, it's probably not going to happen in the next week or 2, but we're targeting right now July 8th or 15th for another meeting. So I will send out an email to the EPAC with those 2 dates to see if people feel strongly about one or the other. I'm partial to the 8th because it's sooner, but it's also the Monday right after the July 4th holiday weekend, so that might be tough for some folks who are traveling. So I'll send that out by email, and we can kind of take a poll of folks that way. I also want to give an update on the other work being done under the CGPP. The scenario 2 and 3 capacity expansion modeling is underway, and so sometime in the next month or 2, we hope to be able to come to you all and present those results as well. And I think you'll be very well tuned to be able to analyze and review that material after you've seen what you've seen today. It'll be very similar in the presentation, but the data, obviously the results will be different, so they'll be good to react to. And then we're also starting the process of moving this scenario 1 capacity expansion modeling into stage 2. There's some work going on behind the scenes already, setting up power flow models and nodal models. And we're coming to you all again, obviously, in a couple of weeks with the siting methodology. So everybody knows how that translation is going to be happening. If you have thoughts in the meantime on what you see in this document, what you heard today, please send them over. We can translate those to utilities through the EPAC email address if you'd like to provide any additional details, because this work will be ongoing into stage 2 and 3 and 4, so we can kind of keep the process moving, because the timeline is very short and we have a lot of work to do here. But I do appreciate everybody showing up and participating today. And with the last couple of minutes, I'll just open it back up, see if there's any questions about the timeline or anything else I said.
There isn't a question about the timeline, Skylar. I got a real quick modeling question still.
Okay. Go for it.
This is Bill Acker again. Just is the model right now being constrained by a local capacity requirement for each of the zones? And you know, I'm thinking about if the headroom still is left of this particular zone, you still might go someplace else for capacity requirements. And if so, are those being changed over time?
Someone from the NICE want to take that? I mean, my understanding is yes, we are modeling the LCRs. It's hard to tell which ones might be, you know, quote unquote binding, but the NICE folks might have more to say on that.
Yeah, Skylar, thanks for that. This is Sarah Karkner again from the NISO. So yes, we do have locational capacity requirements modeled for the lower Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island. Details on those assumptions are included in the materials for the System and Resource Outlook study. That said, I can't speak to, you know, whether or not and how often they're binding, but they are imposed as minimum requirements. So they could be binding or there could be capacity beyond those minimum requirements. I hope that helps answer the question.
It does, Sarah. And for like 2040 and 2042, is the assumption that they're similar amount, assuming you're not running a complete, or if you are running a complete, you know, study to get an LCR?
Right. So, like I mentioned, the details on what our assumptions are included in the Outlook materials. We do have those requirements change a bit through time, but we do have them as the UCAP equivalent of the requirements. So it's, you know, arguably more stable through time than the ICAP equivalent, but the exact details are that are included in our Outlook materials. If you have any trouble finding it, please just email me. I can.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, with that, I think I'll close the meeting. Thanks everybody for joining, and you'll hear from me by email shortly, and we'll meet again in a few weeks. Have a good afternoon. Stay cool.
Thanks.